I wasn't in a good place that winter, and saying it that plain still feels like the truest version. I was 52, built like a man who'd spent 3 decades stretching wire and driving posts, and I trusted numbers more than moods. 40-pound sacks, 3/8 bolts, 7-day forecasts, diesel prices, snowfall totals. Numbers sat still for you. Numbers didn't leave. 3 years earlier, Marla had a stroke in January, quick and cruel the way cold can be. And after the funeral, the house turned into a structure I maintained instead of a place I lived. I inherited the Foothill place from my dad and used to think of it as a gift. By that winter, it felt more like acreage I was duty-bound to keep from sliding back into brush and ruin. The only thing that had a name in my mind was the bitter winter, and I meant it 2 ways every time I said it. The season that froze pipes, cracked trough valves, and shoved ridge wind through every bad seal. And the other freeze that had settled into me and narrowed my life down to chores, black coffee, and silence. My alarm went off at 4:45 even on Sundays because livestock don't care what day it is. I swung my legs out of bed, sat there until my knees remembered themselves, and listened for the house noises I used to take for granted. No kettle click, no radio low in the kitchen. No Marla humming half a line of a song, then forgetting the words. Just the furnace trying, failing, then trying again. I pulled on long johns, canvas pants stiff from yesterday's mud, wool shirt, coat. Boots by the door, same place every night. Tuck, my old blue heeler, lifted his head from the mat, gave me one look that said we were late by 3 minutes and stood up with a groan that matched my own. Outside dawn wasn't light yet, just a grey promise over black timber. The cold had teeth that morning. It took the inside of your nose first, then your fingertips through gloves that had worked fine in November and turned decorative by January. I broke ice in the stock tank with the flat end of a bar and heard that clean glass sound echo off the barn wall. Feed, scoop, pour. Hens first, then the 2 cows, and the winter calf in the lee pen. Check the mineral block, kick the heater cord at the trough until it behaved. Tuck circled wide and came back, all business, no fuss. He was 12 and still thought every task belonged partly to him. After feed came the driveway. 8 inches overnight, wind packed at the bend where the fence line opened. I backed the plough truck out, old Ford with a heater that either roasted your shins or did nothing at all, and pushed drifts to the shoulder while the sky worked itself from charcoal to dull steel. Then patchwork. A sagging corner brace on the north pasture. One hinge on the equipment shed that had finally admitted defeat. A section of woven wire where an elk had come through 2 nights back and left me a lesson in leverage. By 7:30, I'd drunk 2 mugs of coffee gone lukewarm on the bench and said maybe 6 words total, all of them to Tuck. Come on. Out of there. Good dog. Move. That was the shape of my days, and it didn't vary much because variation meant thought, and thought went to places I couldn't stand in for long. If I kept moving, I could stay practical. If I stayed practical, I could pretend the life I had now was enough because it functioned. There's a kind of pride in function when grief is fresh. 3 years in, function starts to look like hiding. I'd still take fence jobs in town and up canyon, mostly repairs after wind or deer, or one bad decision involving a borrowed horse trailer. Folks knew me as steady, show up on time, do it right, invoice plain. My nearest neighbour, Walt Bremer, had a ranch 1.5 miles down the county road, and we'd cross paths when one of us needed a hand with a gate hung crooked by frost heave. That Tuesday, he rolled up while I was resetting a post near the mailbox, his hood rattling and his coffee sloshing in a stainless mug he treated like state property. "You hear they're calling for another Front Friday?" he asked, stepping out and stamping snow from his boots. "Heard. 25-mile gusts on the ridge, maybe more. Walt shook his head. I'm tired of thaw, freeze, thaw. Ground's like concrete in the morning and soup by noon. Welcome to January. He looked toward the house, then back at me. You making it all right up here? It was a decent question, asked by a decent man, and I gave him the answer I gave everybody. Work's steady, cows are fat, truck still starts. Walt gave one of those half smiles men use when they know they aren't getting the full thing. That's not what I asked. I set the tamping bar down and leaned on it. I know. He took a sip and nodded like we'd completed a transaction. You need anything, Holler? Same to you. That was about as deep as I let most conversations go. Practical to practical. Fence to weather. Salt blocks to snowpack. It kept me from hearing my own voice say what was true, which was that I was talking less each year because talking made you remember there had once been someone worth talking to all day long about nothing much at all. By noon I was in the barn loft, throwing down small bales and counting what I had left before the next delivery. I kept a notebook on a nail and wrote numbers in block print because my handwriting had gone sloppy the winter Marla died and never quite came back. 26 bales alfalfa, 9 grass mix, 2 cut twine bundles, replace loft bulb, call Pete about chains, ordinary entries, ordinary life. But every December, no matter how hard I tried to keep my world to lists, I started making one drive that wasn't on paper. I'd finish chores, wait until light went thin, then take the truck to the same turnout on Alder Creek, where Marla used to sit with a thermos and watch snow pile on cedar boughs like icing. She loved that bend because the water slowed and widened there, and the whole bank went quiet in a way she called church without walls. I used to tease her for that line. She was right, and I hated that she was right. That evening, with the sky flattening toward dusk, I tossed a wool blanket and an old green thermos into the passenger seat and whistled for Tuck. He jumped up slower than he used to, turned twice, and settled with his chin on the console. The county road was rutted, and the truck pulled right when it hit hardpack, so I kept both hands firm and let the heater stay off. Folks think that sounds like punishment. It wasn't. Warm cab, warm hands, all that, it made the trip feel like pretending. Cold felt closer to honest. Cold didn't ask me to move on. Alder Creek turnout sat just past mile marker 12, where the shoulder widened enough for 2 trucks if both drivers respected mirrors. I backed in, killed the engine, and listened to the sudden hush after metal stops, vibrating. Creek water under skim ice has a small, steady sound, like someone tearing paper a long way off. The cedars above the bank held yesterday's snow in thick pads. Every once in a while one slid free and dropped with a soft thump that sent powder drifting through the last light. I stayed in the cab a long while, hands wrapped around the thermos cap cup, coffee gone bitter and perfect. Tuck watched the windshield, then the trees, then me, like he was clocking my breathing. I'd come to that spot enough times that my body knew the order. Sit, stare, think of Marla's red scarf, think of her laugh when I slipped on creek stones, think of the hospital corridor with bad coffee and bright lights, think of the quiet after. People tell you grief changes shape. Mine did, but not into anything easier. It became routine, which is a different kind of heavy. Predictable, daily, stubborn. Some nights I talked out loud in the truck, low enough that if a rig passed it would just hear a man clearing his throat. I told her fence news mostly. I told her Walt still refused to replace that leaning gatepost by his lower pasture and would complain about it until spring. I told her Tuck had started dreaming loud and chasing rabbits in his sleep. I told her the kitchen faucet still dripped when the temperature swung fast, and I still hadn't fixed it, because the sound kept me company, Then I sat there feeling foolish for reporting my life to the dead like I was calling in to a dispatcher. There was one evening in that stretch when I caught myself apologizing to an empty passenger seat because I'd forgotten to buy oranges, and I laughed so hard at my own brain I had to wipe my eyes. It was not a graceful laugh. It was the kind that says the gears are still turning, but one tooth is chipped. I said, "Clint, you old fool." And Tuck thumped his tail like he agreed. The light dropped another shade, blue settling into the timber. I stepped out, boots crunching through crusted snow, and walked to the flat rock where Marla always set her thermos. I kept that little place clear if I could, brushing leaves off in fall, knocking snow from the top when the pack was light. It was one of the few rituals I had left that felt like care instead of maintenance. I stood there with my gloved hand on the stone and finally said what had been true a long time. "I talk less every year, Ma." The words hung in the cold and went nowhere. No answer, no sign, no miracle, just creek and trees and the ache behind my ribs that had become familiar enough to wear smooth edges. That was the hour I felt most exposed, with daylight gone and chores done and no task left to hide inside. I'd look at the house lights in the distance through trees and think about how many rooms can be full of objects and empty of life at the same time. Tuck hopped down and moved a slow circle around me, nose up, then stood facing the tree line above the creek. Usually he'd give one warning bark at deer or at the wind if it hit wrong. That evening he didn't make a sound. He lowered himself into the snow, paws crossed, ears forward, easy as if we were waiting for someone late to supper. I followed his gaze and saw only trunks and shadow, and a narrow seam of pale sky between branches. I told myself he was listening to mice under the crust, or maybe just resting his old joints. Practical reasons, good reasons. Still, I stayed where I was longer than planned, listening to the kind of silence that made small sounds stand out. The slide of snow dust off fir needles, creek ice ticking at the edge, Tuck's steady breath. When the cold reached through my coat and found my spine, I went back to the truck. I didn't start it right away. I sat with my hands on the wheel and looked once more toward the rock, the cedars, the bank where Marla used to watch winter gather itself branch by branch. The bitter winter had taken plenty from me already, and that night it felt like it was asking for one more thing, the last habit that still tied me to her in a way I could touch. I gripped the wheel and said, quiet, but clear, "Not this spot. You don't get this spot." Tuck climbed back in and leaned his shoulder against my leg, heavy and warm through denim. I turned the key, let the engine catch, and drove home through a road of packed white and blue dusk, carrying the same grief I'd brought with me, but carrying it awake instead of numb. When I turned into my driveway, the porch light had already haloed over with blowing crystals, each one catching yellow for a second before the wind shoved it sideways. I parked by the barn, sat with the engine idling, and listened to the tick of cooling metal under the bigger sound of gusts moving through the cottonwoods. Tuck stayed pressed against my leg until I cut the key. Then he straightened, shook once, and looked toward the dark timber above the house like he was still listening to a conversation I couldn't hear. I told him, supper first, mysteries later, and he gave me that old dog look that could mean agreement or pity. Inside, the kitchen smelled like coffee grounds and cedar smoke from the stove I'd banked that morning. I warmed canned stew, fed Tuck, checked the back mudroom for frozen lines, and laid out my morning clothes by habit. I should have gone to bed early. Instead, I stood at the sink with the light off, staring out at the yard while the faucet made that one slow drip I kept promising to fix. My mind kept circling the same small thing, the way Tuck had lain down at the creek, calm as Sunday afternoon, ears forward, waiting. Not alert, not anxious. Waiting. I'd seen him read weather, coyotes, strangers, elk, even a bad-tempered rooster at Walt's place. He was rarely wrong. That thought stayed with me when I finally crawled under quilts and listened to wind strike the east wall in long, low pushes. By morning, the front had turned to wet snow, heavy and mean, the kind that clings to every surface and then freezes into trouble by noon. I got up at 4:45, pulled on stiff pants, and stepped into a world gone muffled. No sharp crunch underfoot, just that soaked hush where every sound arrives dull around the edges. Feed came first, then water checks, then scraping slop out of the wheelbarrow before it set like concrete. Tuck worked beside me, but he kept pausing, nose lifted, looking past the barn toward the county road, then toward the timber ridge above Alder Creek. He wasn't wound up. He was attentive in a way I recognized from his younger years, when Marla would pick up the truck keys, and he knew before I did where we were headed. By mid-afternoon, the snowfall eased into a fine mist, and I finished enough chores to earn 1 hour before dark. I told myself I was driving to the creek to check road conditions, and nothing else. If you've ever lied to yourself in a practical voice, you know how clean it can sound. I grabbed the old thermos, whistled, and Tuck came fast despite his hips. The road to mile marker 12 was wet black ribbon in spots, slush in others, with cedar boughs bowed low and dropping water in cold, slow drips. At the turnout, I backed in where I always did and shut the engine down. That silence met me again, only deeper. No chickadee chatter, no squirrel scratch. Even the creek seemed to move quietly, as if it had decided not to disturb anyone. I stood by the truck door and could hear, clear as if it were right beside my ear, little slides of snow dust slipping from fir needles and landing soft on already wet ground. The stillness had shape to it. It wasn't empty. It was held. Tuck hopped down and made one circle through the turnout. He sniffed the air, then walked straight to the flat rock where Marla used to set her thermos. He stopped 3 feet short and sat. Just sat, tail settled, ears forward. His whole posture said, "This is fine. This is expected." I felt my shoulders tighten anyway and started toward him. Halfway there, I saw it. On top of the flat rock sat 3 smooth river stones, each one fist-sized, arranged in a crossed pattern so neat it looked measured. A grey feather lay through the centre where the lines met, not stuck there by chance, but placed. Beside the stones sat a bundle of dry cedar kindling as tidy as anything from a store rack, thumb-thick pieces cut even, all of it wrapped with strips of bark twine braided tight. Wet snow had fallen all day. Every branch on that bank was soaked. Yet that kindling was dry enough I could smell clean cedar from 2 steps away. I stood over it and didn't touch anything for a long minute. My first thought was somebody's joke. My second thought was nobody I knew would bother with this kind of work in that weather. My third thought came harder and louder. Nobody who knew me would pick this exact rock. Not by accident, not for fun. I crouched, pulled a glove off, and held my hand near the bundle without touching. Dry heat wasn't there, no trick, just dry wood in wet country. I looked around for footprints and found only my own fresh boot tracks and Tuck's prints from 30 seconds earlier, already filling with meltwater. I told myself this couldn't be real in the way I was framing it. I worked through every practical explanation I could, that someone could have passed through before the snow started, that the feather could have drifted from somewhere uphill, that the stones might have been there yesterday and I hadn't noticed because grief makes your eyes dull. Then I looked again at the bark twine, the even wraps, the final tuck under the last loop, done with care. I'd tied enough wire and rope in my life to know intention when I saw it. "Come on," I said to Tuck, but my voice came out low like we were in church for real this time. "We're not doing this tonight." He didn't move until I patted my leg. Then he rose easy, glanced once at the tree line, and followed me back to the truck. I drove home with the heater off again and the windshield fogging at the corners because my breathing kept changing pace. At one point, I actually laughed once, short and rough, because I realized I was checking the rearview mirror, like maybe a craftsman ghost was jogging after me with more kindling and instructions. At home, I went through the motions. Feed check, latch check, stove damper half closed. Yet the image of those crossed stones stayed fixed in my mind, like a nailhead that won't set flush. Around 9, I put on my coat, took a flashlight, and walked out to the woodshed. Every piece of split fir under my lean-to was wet at the ends from blown mist. Nothing there was as dry as that cedar bundle had looked. I stood in the beam, breathing steam, and admitted what I didn't want to admit. Something had happened at that rock that didn't fit inside my usual categories. I wasn't ready to name it. I also wasn't able to ignore it. Sleep came in pieces. I woke twice to wind and once to Tuck, shifting on his mat. By the second wake-up, I was done pretending I'd forget the whole thing by morning. Curiosity had already slipped in under the door, quiet and stubborn, and it sat there with me in the dark. At 4:30, before the alarm, I was up. That had never been my pattern. Chores came first, always. But I pulled on boots, poured coffee into the thermos, and clipped Tuck's lead on just to keep him from launching out too fast on the ice. I told myself I'd make a quick stop at Alder Creek, 5 minutes tops, then come back and feed out as usual. The sky was still black and the road was a narrow tunnel through piled snowbanks that reflected headlight beams back at me like dull glass. At the turnout, dawn was only a pale seam behind the ridgeline. I stepped out, and the cold took the wet edge off my face in one breath. Tuck stood quiet at my knee until I unclipped him. Then he moved ahead in a straight line to the flat rock again, same as if he'd rehearsed it. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there wagging once, slow. The stones were still in place. The feather was gone. In its place sat 2 small cedar cones and a strip of red cloth no wider than my thumb, folded twice and laid across the center stone. Not bright red anymore, faded with one frayed edge. I didn't recognize the cloth, but my chest tightened anyway because it looked like it had lived outdoors a while and had still been kept clean. I picked it up carefully. Dry, no mildew smell, no rot. I turned it over in my glove and set it back exactly where it had been. Then I stepped away and scanned the area for tracks while first light reached the creek. That was when I noticed impressions in the snow up near the trees, partly drifted over, each one longer than my boot by a lot and set far apart in a way no man in deep snow would walk, unless he had legs twice as long as mine. They didn't come toward the truck. They curved wide around the turnout and disappeared uphill through spruce. I followed for maybe 20 yards, then stopped, not out of fear, out of respect for my own limits and a rising sense that barging ahead would break something I didn't understand yet. Tuck had come with me but held back, glancing between me and the trees, calm, patient. I turned in a slow circle and listened. Again, that held quiet. Again, no threat in it, just attention. Back at the truck, I sat with my hands around the thermos cup and tried to reason my way back to normal. Big bear, I thought. Bears can move quietly, stand tall, manipulate objects some. But no bear I knew crossed stones on a flat rock and wrapped dry cedar in bark twine during wet snow. Neighbor prank, maybe one of Walt's nephews with too much time. Except the tracks were wrong for boots, and this mountain doesn't attract prank labor at 5 in the morning in freezing wind. I took a long breath and said out loud, "I know what I saw." Saying it didn't solve anything. It just stopped me from pretending. When I got home, chores ran late and sloppy because my head was still at the creek. I overfilled the mineral tub and had to shovel half back. I dropped a latchpin in slush and spent 10 minutes digging with numb fingers while Tuck watched like he had opinions. Around 8, Walt called to ask if I had a spare chain tensioner for his tractor. I told him I did, and he came by an hour later. We stood by the shop stove while he warmed his hands, and I handed him the part. "You're jumpy," he said, not accusing, just noticing. "Road slick out there?" "Road's fine enough." He tipped his head. "Then what?" I looked at the stove door, then at him. "You ever find something out in the timber that looked arranged?" Walt squinted. "Arranged like what?" "Like somebody meant for you to see it." He gave a short shrug. "Sometimes ravens line up shiny things. Sometimes kids stack rocks by streams. Sometimes weather does odd stuff." "Why?" "No reason," I said too fast. "Just saw a little pile by the creek." He studied me another second, then nodded like he'd decided not to press. "Well, if that pile starts paying your hay bill, tell it to come by my place next." I laughed in spite of myself. "If it pays either of us, I'll buy steaks." After he left, I stood in the shop doorway and watched snowmelt drip from the eaves in steady ticks. The practical part of me wanted hard proof, measurements, photographs, explanations I could hand to a skeptic and still keep my own dignity. Another part, quieter but growing, wanted something else. It wanted to go back tomorrow before dawn and see whether the stones were still crossed, whether Tuck would sit in that same respectful place, whether the stillness would gather around the creek bend like it had chosen that spot for reasons of its own. That afternoon, I found myself working faster than usual to clear the deck for evening. I patched a loose hinge, topped off the calf's water, and split a small stack under the overhang before the forecasted freeze. Every task had the same pull under it, a low current pointing me toward Alder Creek. Grief was still there, heavy as wet wool, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. Curiosity had taken a chair. Wonder was standing by the door, pretending not to come in. Just before dusk, I walked into the mudroom, reached up to the shelf where Marla's old odds and ends tin still sat, and opened it for the first time in months. Buttons, safety pins, a church key, one cracked lipstick cap, and at the bottom, a tiny brass button compass no bigger than a quarter, the one she used to clip to her daypack strap when we hiked fence line in summer. It still pointed north when I turned it in my palm. I held it a long moment, then slipped it into my coat pocket without fully deciding why. Tuck was already at the truck, tail tapping once against the tire, ready and patient, like we had a standing appointment and he had no intention of letting me miss it. I slid into the driver's seat, and Tuck jumped up beside me with a little grunt he made when his hips were stiff, then settled like he had already decided this evening mattered. The compass rode in my coat pocket the whole way to Alder Creek, tapping my chest now and then with each rut, a tiny metal reminder that I was doing something I didn't have a good explanation for. Dusk had gone thin and blue by the time I backed into the turnout. No other tire tracks. No fresh plough pass. Just my headlights washing over cedar trunks, and the flat rock by the bank where Marla used to sit and hold her thermos in both hands, like it was a blessing. I shut the truck off and listened. The creek made that paper tear sound under rim ice. Snowmelt dripped in slow ticks from overloaded boughs. Tuck dropped down, shook once, and walked to the rock with calm purpose, then sat 3 feet short, like he had done his part and was waiting on me to do mine. I stepped over crusted slush, pulled the brass compass out, and held it in my palm a moment longer than needed. Marla used to tap it and say, "North is nice, but I trust your bad sense of direction more." I set it beside the crossed stones, not in the center, just near enough to read as an offering and not a demand. Then I backed away and stood with my hands in my pockets, trying not to feel foolish, and feeling foolish anyway. The light kept draining out of the trees. Across the creek, past a stand of lodgepole and a patch of alderbrush flattened by old snow load, I caught movement low first, then high. Not a flash, not a trick of branches. A shape easing between trunks with an odd, measured rhythm, broad shoulders passing where no elk could fit and no man in winter gear could move that quietly. My spine locked hard, then softened by degrees as I watched what it did next. It stepped over a tangle of rabbit runs pressed into the snow crust, lifting each foot clean and placing it in bare gaps. It paused by a fallen limb, bent, picked it up with one huge hand, and laid it aside as gently as setting down a ladder near fresh paint. I should say this plain. I was scared for about 3 heartbeats, but it was the shock of scale, not a sense of threat. Every story I'd ever dismissed came rushing up at once, and none of them fit what I was looking at. The figure stood near 8, maybe 9 feet by my best contractor's eye. Dark fur matted at the lower legs from wet brush. Chest deep and wide enough that 2 fence posts laid shoulder to shoulder came to mind, for no good reason. Yet all its movement was careful, almost formal, as if every step had to clear some private standard of not breaking what didn't need breaking. Tuck didn't bark, he didn't bristle. He stayed seated, tail giving one slow thump on snow, ears pointed forward. That did more for my nerves than any prayer I could have forced out. The figure moved into a thin lane of open ground between trees and stopped in full view. Not close. 30 yards, maybe a little more. Head angled toward me. I could make out eyes catching the last grey light, warm brown with an amber cast, steady and unhurried. I heard myself whisper, "Evening," like I'd met a neighbour at the hardware store. Then, because my own manners seemed to have divorced my better judgment, I added, "Excuse me if I'm in your spot." I actually said that out loud to a creature taller than my feed room door, and if Marla had seen it, she'd have laughed until she cried. The big figure held still another few breaths, then shifted its weight and stepped backward once, giving me room I hadn't asked for but clearly needed. No rush, no bluff. It turned sideways so I could see the breadth of it one more time, then eased behind the lodgepoles and was gone in the kind of quiet that made me doubt my own hearing. I stood there until the cold worked into my boots and my hands started to ache through wool. When I looked back at the rock, the compass still sat where I'd placed it, arrow trembling faintly in the deepening cold. Tuck rose and leaned his shoulder into my knee as if to say, we were finished for tonight. I nodded to nobody in particular and walked us back to the truck. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that careful hand moving a branch aside. I lay there in the dark and ran explanations like I was troubleshooting a hydraulic line. Misread distance, Big Bear standing tall, 2 stumps and low light making patterns, fatigue from early mornings and too much coffee. I told myself this couldn't be real in the shape my mind was giving it. Then another voice in me, one I didn't like because it sounded honest, kept saying I knew what I saw. Around 2:30 I gave up, put on socks and sat at the kitchen table with the stove ticking and Tuck snoring by the door. I drew the turnout in my notebook from memory, marked the trees, marked where I stood, marked where it stood. Practical work, mapping facts. The drawing looked clean. My certainty didn't. At dawn, I drove back before chores, which would have made my old self shake his head at me. The turnout was pale with fresh skim and the sky had that bruised look that means more weather coming. My truck's tracks from last night were soft-edged now. Around them, circling wide, were fresh prints that were neither hoof nor boot. Long, deep impressions with toe marks visible at the front, stride too far for any man slogging snow. They looped around the turnout in a broad arc and crossed behind where my truck had sat, never once approaching the driver door. That detail hit me harder than the size did. Whatever had made them could have come close. It had chosen not to. At the rock, the compass was still there, but not where I'd left it. It sat centered between the crossed stones, needle steady, and beside it lay a short braid of bark twine with a tiny knot at each end, the same tying style as the first kindling bundle. No theatrics, just intention. I crouched down and held my glove over the compass like I was warming it by habit. "All right," I said, low. "I see you." Tuck stood next to me, relaxed enough to yawn, then looked upslope toward the spruce cluster and sat, respectful distance like always. I followed his gaze and caught a dark shoulder between trunks, partly hidden, still as a stump but with a quality no stump ever had. Watching, not pressing. A mule deer stepped out below the spruce then, head down, pawing at shallow snow for forage. It fed there for a good minute with that huge form within easy sightline. No stomping, no alarm snort, just a deer acting like evening chores had started, and everyone knew their place. That simple scene undid another knot in me. Predators change the behavior of everything around them. This presence seemed to settle things instead. I stayed kneeling long enough for my knees to complain, then stood slow and gave a small nod toward the trees, because words felt too blunt for what was happening. By midday I was behind on feed and had a mind full of static. Walt called asking if I could look at a snapped gate chain near his lower pasture, and I said I'd swing by after lunch. We stood in his mudlot with sleet tapping our coats while I fitted a replacement link, and he held tension with gloved hands. "You look like a man trying to remember where he set his hat," he said. "Could be I left my hat in another county." He grinned. "Could be you need a day off. Wouldn't know what to do with one." He studied me for a beat, then said, "You heading to that creek bend again tonight?" I glanced up. "Why you ask that?" "Saw your tracks there yesterday when I hauled salt. Same turnaround you've been favoring since Marla. Ain't my business. Just don't slide off in the dark." I tightened the chain and stood. I'm not sliding anywhere. Walt brushed sleet off his sleeve. "All right then. If you see a giant bear out there, tell him my fence invoice is in arrears." He said it dry, but his eyes held a little question. I gave him the same half-truth I'd been living on. "If I see anything paying bills, you'll be first to know." Freezing rains started just before dusk, the bad kind that looks like mist until it hits and hardens. I was splitting a quick stack under the porch overhang when the maul handle slipped in my wet glove and nearly clipped my shin. That shook me enough to stop for the night. I secured the calf shelter latch, checked water twice, and meant to tarp the main woodpile by the shed, but got distracted by a frozen hinge pin on the side gate. By the time I finished wrestling it free, the rain had turned to glass on every surface and my fingers were clumsy. I told myself the pile would hold one night. I should have known better. After supper, I drove to Alder Creek anyway, because by then, not going felt like lying. I parked, stepped out into a fine hiss of ice, and found 2 bundles of dry cedar laid by the flat rock, each tied with bark twine and set on a little bed of fir boughs to keep them off the wet ground. No stones disturbed, compass still centered. I stood there with sleet ticking off my coat, and felt a strange mix of gratitude and embarrassment, like someone had noticed me struggling with chores I used to do without thinking. Tuck walked to the spruce line, sat, and looked back at me once. I followed and stopped at the respectful distance he seemed to have negotiated on my behalf. Through branches I saw the broad shape again, half-shadowed, head inclined slightly as if waiting to see what I'd do. I lifted one cedar bundle, dry as kiln stock. I held it to my chest and said, "Thank you." My voice broke on the second word, not from tears yet, just from disuse in that register. The figure didn't move closer. It shifted one step back, giving the same room as before. We stayed like that longer than I can measure by clock, sleet whispering through needles, creek talking under ice, my dog seated between us like an old foreman making sure everyone kept good manners. Then the figure turned and moved upslope, each step deliberate, placing feet in openings between saplings. No drama, no vanishing trick, just a quiet departure into timber. I brought the cedar home and set it by the stove. The house smelled better within minutes, warmer somehow, though the thermometer hadn't budged. In the night, freezing rain hit hard, and then a wind shift rattled the eaves. I woke at first light, pulled on boots, and stepped out expecting a mess. The yard was glazed. Fence wire hummed low in gusts. I turned toward the woodshed and stopped dead. My whole main woodpile, the one I'd neglected, had been restacked tight under the big canvas tarp I kept folded on a nail. Not tossed over. Properly pitched with a ridgeline so water ran off both sides. Corners weighted with split rounds, front flap tucked and pinned with two smooth branches. Whoever had done it knew weather and knew wood. The stack itself had been reworked by size. Thick rounds to the back, shoulder splits to the front, kindling crate filled and set under cover. The only tracks around it were those same long impressions, softened at edges by overnight glaze, but plain enough. They came from the side pasture, looped by the shed, and went back toward the timber strip that led down toward Alder Creek. I stood there holding my coffee like a fool while my breath smoked, and my mind tried one last round of denial. Could Walt have done this as a prank? Not in that rain, not with those tracks, not without waking me and Tuck both. Could I have done it half asleep? I snorted at myself. I can barely find my glasses before sunrise, let alone engineer a weatherproof stack in freezing rain. Tuck trotted up, sniffed the tarp edge, then sat and looked at me with that steady old dog patience that says, "Catch up, partner." I set my cup on the fence post and put both hands on the tarp ridge, feeling how tight and clean it was. Practical kindness. No mystery flourish. Just exactly what I had failed to get done before the storm. I laughed once, soft and shaky, and shook my head at the empty yard. "You're better at this than I am," I said, and for the first time in a long while the words didn't feel like talking into a void. They felt received. I didn't see him that morning. I didn't need to. The work stood there in front of me, dry wood in bitter weather, and it had my name on it without a single letter written. Tuck leaned against my leg as wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the ridge stayed iron grey. The bitter winter was still very much in charge of the season, but standing beside that covered stack, I felt a small thaw start, where I'd been frozen solid for 3 years, and I knew I'd be back at the creek again by dusk, not chasing proof, just keeping a quiet appointment. Both of us seemed to understand. By dusk, the sky had lowered another notch, thick wool grey over the ridge, and the weather radio on my counter kept repeating the same clipped warnings about a major front, pushing hard out of the west. I loaded 2 sacks of feed in the truck bed, topped off the diesel can, and threw an extra chain, shovel, and tow strap behind the seat. I told myself I was just preparing like any sensible man would. Under that, I knew I was bracing for something I couldn't diagram. Tuck watched every move from the mudroom threshold, tail still, eyes bright. When I picked up my coat, he was already at the door. At Alder Creek, the turnout was rimmed in old ice and fresh powder, and the cedars above the bank had that heavy posture that comes right before a storm breaks loose. I walked to the flat rock with my breath running white in front of me. The crossed stones were where they'd been. The compass sat beside them, centered and steady, and someone had laid 3 short willow twigs in a fan shape, pointing toward the creek bend where Marla's memorial bench sat under snow. I hadn't gone down to that bench in a week. The drifts near the bank got deep and slick, and I'd been putting it off. Seeing those twigs arranged like that landed in me as plain instruction. Check there, tonight. I crouched and touched one twig with a gloved finger. All right, I said. I hear you. Tuck stood back near the spruce line, not tense, just attentive. I followed his gaze and caught a dark outline between trunks, broad shoulders half hidden in the dim. He didn't step out. He didn't need to. We held that quiet for a minute, maybe 2. Creek talking low under ice, wind beginning to comb the treetops. I lifted my hand, not waving exactly, just acknowledging. The outline dipped once, almost like a nod, and eased farther into timber. On the drive home, fat flakes started, then sleet, then snow again. The kind of switchback weather that chews through roads and patience. By 10, the power blinked twice and died for good, taking the furnace and porch light with it. I banked the stove, lit 2 oil lamps, and sat at the kitchen table with Tuck pressed against my boot, while wind rattled the windows in steady pulses. The bitter winter had found new teeth. At midnight, I checked the barn with a flashlight and came back with my mustache glazed and my gloves stiff. The calf was on his feet but skittish, blowing steam. The latch on the lee shelter was icing over, opening slow. I chipped it free with a screwdriver and told myself to move the calf to the deeper side in the morning if this kept up. Morning never really got bright. It just went from black to white. Snow drove sideways so hard I could barely see the fence 15 yards out. One power line had come down across the county road overnight. Walt called from his truck on the hill where he could still get a signal. "Road crew says maybe tomorrow," he shouted over static. "You all right up there?" "Fine enough," I said. "You?" "Generator's running. You got fuel?" "Plenty. You stay put." "You too. Don't play hero today." I almost laughed at that. By noon I was outside anyway, shoulders into the wind, trying to keep ordinary things from becoming emergencies. I hauled water by hand when the line to the trough froze solid. I cleared a path from porch to barn twice and watched it fill again in 10 minutes. I fought the calf shelter latch with numb fingers and got it working, then looked down slope toward Alder Creek and saw open water spreading where it should have been crusted over. Overflow had started. My stomach dropped when I pictured the memorial bench Marla's brother had built, the one set near the bend under 2 cedars. Half buried was fine. Swept downstream was not something I was willing to accept. I stood in the yard with wind pushing at my coat and worked the math. If I went to the creek now with rope and bar, I might shore the bench before the bank gave way. But the calf had started pacing in the pen, and if the drift piled on the wrong side of that shelter, he could panic and break through a weak panel. I couldn't do both quickly enough in that weather. That was the truth of it. For a minute, I just stood there, furious at weather, at timing, at grief, at everything that had made me a man counting losses before they happened. I chose the creek first. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe it was loyalty. I grabbed rope, maul, and 2 short posts, whistled for Tuck, and went down slope bent into the gusts. Snow came at us like thrown sand. Halfway there, my boot hit hidden ice under powder, and I went down hard on one knee, then both hands. No injury, just that sharp jolt up the thigh that says you're not 20 anymore. Tuck circled back, nose at my sleeve, then moved ahead 2 steps and looked back as if to pace me. I got up and kept moving. The bench was in worse shape than I expected. Water had eaten a channel behind it, and one leg was hanging over slush where the bank had undercut. I dropped to work, driving one post as a brace, trying to loop rope under the seat without sliding into the channel. Wind took my hat. I left it. Snow packed into my collar and melted down my neck. I managed one brace and reached for the second when I heard a deep crack upslope from the direction of the yard. Wood on wood. Not a tree fall, but a gate or panel giving way. The calf bawled once, high and scared. I froze in place, rope in hand, caught between what was in front of me and what might be breaking behind me. That was the moment it happened. Through the white churn at the edge of my vision, a dark shape moved between cedars, not fast, not dramatic, just certain. He stepped into the open near the bench, snow clinging to fur along his arms and shoulders, and in that flat stormlight his size looked even larger than before, yet nothing about him carried force toward me. He looked at the bench, then at me, then at the channel eating the bank. I backed one step to give him space I didn't know how to offer except physically. He took the deadfall log I'd been trying to shift with leverage and lifted it as if it were green kindling. He set it crosswise behind the bench, angled against the 2 cedar roots, then pressed it down with both hands to seat it into snow and mud. Deliberate, precise. He grabbed the second short post I'd dropped, drove it with 3 firm pushes, and pinned my rope under the log so the seat sat level above the waterline. Every motion solved a problem I'd been fumbling with for 10 minutes. I stood there with the maul hanging useless in my hand, watching a creature no field guide ever prepared me for secure, the one object I'd been unwilling to lose. Then he turned his head toward the barn. The calf bawled again, closer now, and I saw him through blowing snow at the edge of the yard, out of the pen and stumbling in drifts where the panel had shifted. Tuck was near him, not nipping, just trying to hold him from bolting. I started uphill, but my footing failed twice in 3 steps on glazed snow. By the time I got to the halfway rise, he was already there. He did not rush the calf. That mattered. He came around wide, placing himself between the calf and the open slope, then angled his body so the wind hit his back instead of the animal's face. He lowered one arm, palm open, not touching at first, making a loose barrier while Tuck moved to the opposite side. The calf sidestepped, snorted, then drifted where they both left room, toward the lee of the barn where the snow was shallower. When the calf balked at the doorway, he tapped the side panel once with his knuckles, gentle, and stepped back. The calf went in. Tuck followed, then turned and sat in the doorway, like a little sentry with snow on his muzzle. I reached the barn corner, breathing hard enough to taste iron and cold. He stood 20 yards out in the storm, chest rising slow, head slightly bowed, hands empty at his sides. The white between us swirled and opened and closed again. I felt something in me give way that had been locked for 3 years by willpower and routine and stubborn pride. I leaned one hand on the barn wall, tried to speak, failed, and then Marla's name came out of me like it had been waiting at a shut door. Marla. I said it once, and then again, louder into the wind, and I started crying right there in wet gloves and frozen jeans like a man who had finally run out of places to store grief. Not neat tears, full body, shaking, ugly crying I hadn't let happen at the funeral, at the hospital, at any lonely kitchen dawn. I told myself for years that holding it together was strength. In that storm I learned it was mostly fear. I cried for her and for me, and for the wasted seasons I'd spent living like a caretaker in my own life. He did not step closer. He did not turn away. He stood with that same steady posture, witness without intrusion, and waited while I got through it. Tuck came and pressed his flank against my leg, and I rested my glove on his head until my breathing slowed. When I finally looked up, the snow had eased just enough that I could see those amber-brown eyes clear through the white, calm and patient as creek water in summer shade. I managed one sentence. "Thank you for helping me keep what matters." He held my gaze a moment longer, then shifted his weight back one step, then another, making that familiar choice to leave room. He turned toward the timber strip above the creek and moved off in measured strides, placing each foot clean between buried brush. Within 10 seconds, the storm folded around him, and he was gone. I got the calf latched safe and checked twice. When I made it to the porch near dark, 2 armloads of dry split wood were stacked under the overhang by the door, sheltered from the blow. Not tossed, stacked. Fir and cedar mixed for quick catch and long burn. I hadn't brought that wood up. I hadn't had time. I stood there with snow sliding off my shoulders and laughed through the last of my tears, because of course, he'd thought of that too. Practical mercy, again. That night by lamplight, I sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, with Tuck asleep by the stove, and listened to wind move farther down valley. My face felt raw, eyes swollen, body exhausted, clear through the bone. But the house did not feel empty the same way. Grief was still in it, yes, but not as a locked room. More like a door I could open without being knocked flat. I slept 6 straight hours for the first time in months. At first light, the storm had blown east, leaving a hard, bright sky and snowfields scored with drifts like frozen waves. I walked to Alder Creek on packed crust, moving slow where ice glazed the path. The memorial bench sat above floodline, braced solid by deadfall and rope, exactly where it ought to be. I put my hand on the seat, cold through the glove, and whispered, "Still here." Then I went to the flat rock. The crossed stones were clean. A grey feather lay through the centre. On top of the front stone sat a knit glove, red once, faded now. One thumb mended with tan thread I recognised from Marla's sewing jar. She'd dropped that glove on a windy day years ago near the creek bend, and we never found it despite looking. I'd forgotten the mended thumb until I saw it again. The glove was dry, clean. No leaves, no mildew, no rot. I picked it up with both hands, and for a long while I could not do anything but hold it. "I know," I said into the morning stillness. "I know." I set the glove against my chest under my coat and left the stones undisturbed. When I looked toward the spruce cluster, there was no dark outline there, no motion, only winter light striping bark and a raven working high branches. The stillness felt gentle, complete, like a conversation that had reached its natural end. The next evenings I still drove to the turnout, not because I was afraid it had ended and not because I thought I could make it happen on command. I went because that place had become honest again. Sometimes I found a small sign, a new cone by the stones, a twig braid, one broad print at the edge of melt. Sometimes nothing at all except creek and cedar and Tuck breathing beside me. Once, a week after the storm, I saw him one last time that season at dusk, far upslope in slant gold light between lodgepoles. He stopped, looked down toward us, and placed one hand on the trunk of a young fir as if to steady it while he passed. Then he moved on without hurry and did not return that winter. The road crews finally cleared the county line. Power came back with a thunk and furnace rattle. Walt drove up to check my place and found me replacing the cracked calf panel. "Heard your line was down for 2 days," he said. "You manage?" "Managed," I said. He looked at the bench from the yard, then at the stacked wood under my porch. "That bench got shored up real professional in a storm where nobody should have been out." I tightened the bolt and met his eyes. I had help. "From who?" I wiped my gloves on my coat. "You probably won't like my answer." Walt leaned on the fence and studied me, then gave a small shrug. Try me. So I told him plain. Not every detail, just enough. The stones, the tracks, the storm, the bench, the calf. I watched skepticism move across his face and then settle into something softer. Not belief exactly, not disbelief either. When I finished, he scratched his jaw and said, "Well, I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," I said. "I'm not selling tickets." He huffed a laugh. "Fair enough. You look different, though." "Different how?" "Like you slept, like you came back in the room." I looked out toward Alder Creek and nodded once. "That sounds about right." Late February thawed by day and froze hard by night. On the first clear Saturday, I fixed the kitchen faucet that had dripped for 3 years. It took 15 minutes and one washer from the coffee can under the sink. When I turned the handle and heard silence, real silence, not leakage, I stood there with wet hands and smiled at myself like an idiot. Then I opened windows for 10 minutes despite the cold and let fresh air run through every room. The following Thursday, I called Walt and the Mendozas from the next ridge, asked if they'd come up Sunday evening for stew. Walt said, "You sure?" Like I'd invited him to a formal dance. I said, "I make decent stew and have too many chairs with nobody in them." He brought cornbread mix. Lila Mendoza brought pickled beans, and her husband Tom brought a pie that leaned but tasted fine. Their 2 boys stomped snow off boots in my mudroom and immediately found Tuck, who accepted ear scratches like a retired mayor receiving honours. We ate at my long table under the old light Marla picked out years ago. Conversation started with weather and feed costs because that's what people know how to do, then spread wider. Walt told a story about getting his tractor stuck in spring mud up to both axles. Lila laughed so hard she had to set down her spoon. One of the boys asked why my fence pliers hung by the back door like decorations, and I told him any tool that useful deserved front row seating. At one point, Walt looked around and said, quieter, "House feels good in here, Clint." I said, "It does," and meant it. After dishes, with coffee poured and snow tapping soft at the windows, Tom asked the question everyone had tiptoed around. "You really see what you told Walt?" I set my mug down and answered the way I'd promised myself I would from then on. "Yes, I did. He was kind. He helped in a storm when I couldn't do all of it alone. You can believe that or not. I'm not asking for agreement." Layla held my gaze and nodded slowly. "You sound sure." "I am." Tom rubbed his chin, half smile, half wonder. "World's wider than we admit, I guess." "That's where I landed," I said. By spring mud season, we were doing stew nights once a month, rotating houses sometimes, but often mine because folks said my stove room felt easy to sit in. I repaired the porch steps, painted the mudroom trim Marla had wanted done, and sorted 3 boxes of her things without shutting down halfway through. I kept the red glove in the top drawer by the sink, folded around the tiny brass compass. Not hidden, not displayed, just kept. When December came back around, sharp and bright and full of old ache, I drove to Alder Creek on the first cold evening and parked at the turnout with the heater off by choice, not punishment. Tuck, stiffer now but still game, climbed down and walked with me to the flat rock. The marker remained. Crossed stones, feather, clean space around it like the place held itself apart from weather. I set a small bundle of dry cedar there tied with twine from my own shed, my best attempt at neat work. Then I stood and waited in that patient stillness. Near full dark, a shape moved at the spruce edge upslope, broad and familiar, no closer than before. He stood where the last light caught the line of his shoulder, then dipped his head once. I lifted my hand and touched the brim of my cap. No words needed. After a minute, he turned and went back into timber, quiet as falling snow. One brief visit, like a promise kept. That became the rhythm. Each winter, once, maybe twice if weather pressed hard, a sign or a glimpse at the creek bend. Always gentle, always at distance, never asking for more than acknowledgement. The rest of the year belonged to ordinary work. Posts to set, calves to watch, gutters to clear, neighbours to feed, stories to share around my table. The bitter winter still came, because that is what winter does in these hills. Pipes froze, wind howled, roads drifted shut. Grief still visited too, especially on blue evenings when cedar shadows reached long over snow, and I could almost hear Marla humming in the kitchen. But the freeze in me broke for good that January storm night. That's the plain truth. I did not conquer grief. I learned to carry it warm. I did not solve the mystery at Alder Creek. I accepted it as part of the same grounded world where weather reports matter and wrench sizes matter, and so do things we can't quite measure. I still trust numbers. I also trust what I witnessed with my own eyes. Enormous strength choosing care, again and again, with no need to be seen doing it. This morning, years after that first winter, I drove to the bend before dawn with coffee in the green thermos and Tuck's old collar hanging from the mirror because he'd earned that place. Snow had settled deep on cedar boughs and the creek made its small paper sound under ice. I brushed the rock clear with my glove, straightened the feather, and set my hand over the stones like checking a friend's shoulder. No tracks today, no outline in trees, just stillness holding steady all around me. I sat on Marla's bench after, braced and weathered and solid, and watched the light come up through mist. I said her name out loud and smiled when it didn't break me. Then I thanked the winter, not for what it took, but for what it finally gave back. The world remained mysterious, grounded, and kinder than my grief had allowed, and I drove home to a warm kitchen, a full wood box, and a house ready for company.